What if the ugliest, cheapest piece of wood at the lumber store could actually become something that looks expensive? That was the challenge. Instead of starting with premium hardwood, I bought some of the cheapest usable wood I could find and decided to see how far I could push it. And honestly, when I first looked at these boards, they didn't exactly look like expensive furniture material. There were knots, uneven grain, rough surfaces, and plenty of imperfections. But I wasn't going to hide those problems. The goal was to see whether good woodworking, careful preparation, and the right finish could make inexpensive wood look like something much more premium. The first step was selecting the best parts of the boards. When you're working with cheap lumber, you can't always expect every section to look perfect. So instead of treating every board equally, I looked for the sections with the most interesting grain and the fewest serious defects. Then I started breaking the boards down to size. This is where cheap wood can become surprisingly difficult to work with. The boards weren't perfectly straight, so I had to take my time with every cut. I also avoided removing more material than necessary. When the wood itself is inexpensive, it's tempting to think you can just cut away all the ugly parts. But that can quickly leave you with a lot less material than you started with. After cutting everything down, it was time to fix the surfaces. And this is probably the biggest lesson from the entire project. Expensive-looking wood doesn't necessarily start with expensive wood. A huge part of the final appearance comes from preparation. I worked through the surfaces carefully, removing rough areas and gradually refining the boards. I also paid close attention to the edges. Sharp, inconsistent edges can make even a well-built project look cheap. Clean edges, consistent dimensions, and tight joints make a much bigger difference than most beginners realize. Once the pieces were prepared, I started assembling the project. At this point, the cheap lumber was already looking better than it did when I bought it. But there was still one major problem. The natural color and grain weren't giving me the premium appearance I wanted. This is where the finishing process became critical. Instead of trying to make the wood look like something it wasn't, I wanted to enhance what was already there. I tested the finish on a scrap piece first. And that small test made a huge difference. The color changed, the grain became more visible, and suddenly those ordinary boards started looking completely different. But I didn't stop there. I applied the finish carefully and evenly, paying extra attention to areas where the wood could absorb more or less product. The goal wasn't simply to make the wood darker. It was to create depth. Because when you look at high-quality furniture, the finish isn't just about color. It's about how the surface reflects light, how visible the grain is, and how smooth everything feels. After letting the finish dry, I gave the surface another inspection. And this was the moment I was waiting for. The same cheap boards that looked rough and ordinary at the beginning were starting to look like completely different material. But would they actually look expensive? That was the real test. I added the final details, cleaned up the edges, and gave the entire piece one last finish. Then I put it next to the leftover pieces of the original lumber. And honestly, the difference was bigger than I expected. The wood itself didn't magically become premium. The grain didn't suddenly change species. What changed was the way the material was prepared, assembled, and finished. And that's probably the most important lesson from this project. If you're woodworking on a budget, you don't always need better wood. Sometimes you need to get more out of the wood you already have. Good proportions, clean joinery, careful sanding, and a well-tested finish can completely change how inexpensive lumber looks. Would I use this approach for every project? Probably not. Premium hardwood still has advantages, especially when you need specific characteristics, durability, or a particular natural appearance. But for a budget project? Absolutely. Because this experiment proved something I wanted to find out from the beginning. Cheap wood doesn't have to look cheap. And sometimes, the biggest upgrade isn't the material. It's what you do with it. So, if you have a pile of inexpensive lumber sitting in your workshop, don't throw it away just because it doesn't look impressive yet. You might be surprised by what it can become.